Hi, thanks for joining us in one of a series of conversations we're calling Brand Firsthand. I'm Roger Sametz, founder and CEO of Sametz Blackstone Associates, brand-focused strategy, content design, and web consultancy based in Boston. As many of you know, we've been building brands in arts and culture, education and research, financial and professional services, and the civic engagement and nonprofit spaces for over 40 years. And over those years, we've had the privilege of learning from exceptional professionals who make up our client teams, as well as partners of all stripes who we've had the good fortune to work with across our client engagements. Now, in this series of conversations, we're sharing some of those insights that we've learned through our collaborations around what it takes to build brands and tell stories and connect with the people who matter most to you. Today's guest on your screen is Lyn Chamberlin, who works in both institutional and individual spaces in higher ed, social sectors, business, and the arts to build brands. Our focus today is on higher ed. We've had 20 plus years of successful collaborations with Lyn at very different institutions with different models and goals. At Radcliffe, at the Vermont College of Fine Arts, at Sarah Lawrence College, and at the University of New Haven. So we're going to learn a little bit more about the whys and hows of brand building in academia. So let's dig in. The distance that COVID has put between institutions and organizations and their constituencies has changed how organizations can present and prove their value, and has made a strong brand more important than ever. So why is that? Well, certainly in academia, COVID has meant curtailed campus student parent tours, historically an important touch point in a recruitment cycle. Kids can't sit in on classes or meet other students or see what the residential life is like, all of which has made it harder for prospects to see myself here, a major goal in admission materials. And not being able to meet personally with donors or prospective community partners, has made that harder, and not having in-person alumni events, which normally deepen engagement, has also been put on hold through COVID. So, because of all that, one's brand has become ever more important as the avatar of who you are as an organization, and, coming up with the reasons of why, important constituents should care, participate, and give. The upshot of all this is that one's brand can certainly, now more than ever, influence decisions in one's favor or not. All that said, it wasn't that long ago that brand was looked at as a vulgar and commercial thingy in academia. That's changed, and brand is now a buzzword. Even if everyone isn't quite sure what brand is, they know they need one. So, turning to Lyn, how and why are academic institutions now seeing the value of brand and brand building? And over the last decade plus, how have these institutions evolved their approach to brand?
Well, it's such a good question, Roger. And as you well know, we could spend our entire time today just talking about that question. I have a simple answer to that. And I think the reason that brand has become the rallying cry for so many institutions today is that because of COVID, they've been forced to cope with it. They've been forced to define their brand. They've been forced to think about whether we even have a brand. And so I think that it's a little bit holding one's feet to the fire, which we can talk about in a minute. But to go back, you and I have seen so much change over the last 20 years, back when brand was just whispered, if said at all, on college campuses, starting at Harvard, where brand or marketing in general was seen as somehow antithetical to the academic integrity of an institution, and people did not want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. But flipping forward to today, it's the same conundrum, which is that businesses the educational institutions at the end of the day are businesses. And I think that's been a slowly dawning realization as colleges and universities realize that they're competing for the same students, whether you're a small liberal arts college, whether you're a mid-sized university like the University of New Haven, or whether you're one of the Ivies, the students that you want are not yours by default. And that's where brand comes in, because brand is about what you stand for, who you are as an institution, and the business of educating students is based on revenue. And that's another word. A lot of the business lexicon that we're also used to is a new language for many colleges and universities as they look at some of the economic imperatives, COVID aside for the moment, that result in a declining pool of undergraduates, of undergraduate applicants, of the diminishing numbers of international students who have always paid full freight, for the increasingly competitive environment within different regions of the country, when so many schools cannot articulate what their value proposition is. How does one school differentiate itself from another? And so I think that all of those factors have come to a point where I think it's not an overstatement to say that really all colleges and universities are in a moment of identity crisis. And that's where brand comes in. It's going back to who you are as an institution, what makes you valuable. And I think above all, what justifies the tuition that families will be in many cases hard-earned to come up with, and will have to see the return on investment of those dollars.
Great, thanks. Well, let's actually step back and talk about what a brand is really made up of. Yes, schools have their seals, their logos, their sports mascots, but these are symbols of a brand. And they point really, or should point, to what a school means, which in turn is assembled in people's heads. And it's assembled in their heads through, what's the promise of the school? What's their history, which of course is something that's harder to change. What's their position in the landscape? What are their values? And this is then expressed in a lot of the stuff that we do together, in the communications, in their messaging and visual expression, some of the things we don't do together, their offerings, and yes, and this is something people forget all the time, their behavior. But all of this doesn't just come together randomly. It has to be actively managed. And that's also a relatively new concept, which if we talked about, doesn't necessarily happen naturally on a campus. So Lyn, here's a hypothetical question. If you just landed in an academic institution as a new VP of communications and marketing, and it's clear that the organization's brand hasn't been managed, like it's just known as a keg school or something, and it doesn't reflect who they are and want to, and need to be seen as, how do you get started?
Well, I think it's important to understand the ecosystem of university or college and the way that decisions get made. There's no such thing as a straight line in the management of the business of higher education. It doesn't come down from on high and then all the lieutenants start implementing. It is a circular process. And it's one that this circuitous form is its own challenge. And in order to not just implement a brand, but to begin to do the archaeology necessary to talk about the things that you've just mentioned, Roger, the value, the offerings, the behavior, the proposition. It takes an incredibly dedicated listening effort, which, you and I, Roger, have done this many times together, and I've seen the deep dive that you and your team do across the institution, not just talking to key donors and the president, but really talking to the machinery that makes a university what it is, the deans, the department heads, the faculty chairs, the students, the alumni, families, beginning to put that mosaic together of what makes this college what it is and why, at the end of the day, anybody should care. And I think that part of the resistance to branding in higher education is this notion that we're going to try to make them something that they're not, that brand is something that comes from the outside and is sort of put on like a costume and everybody has to just toe the line, when in fact, any brand that's worth its salt is intrinsic and organic and comes from the center. And that's the kind of thing that is not done in a day or a month. It's done when you take the time, as you do, to listen to what everybody thinks that school stands for and what everybody thinks that brand is. And so I think the answer is in how one gets started is that you commit to an egalitarian series of conversations where what everyone thinks matters. And then at the, when that's concluded, that somehow that then boils down to the essence of what a university or a college is, which is where the brand conversations start.
So, and maybe you've partly answered this. I mean, we've certainly had this experience where, leadership of a school thinks their seal or logo, is their brand.
Mm-hmm.
And even if their communications person who reports to them knows otherwise, that's kind of a hump. Like, don't we have a brand? We have a wolf or whatever. Then what?
Well, I think that's the biggest hurdle that one has to get over. It's not only that everybody thinks they know what the brand is. There's a certain amount of stasis that people really don't understand the work that it takes to really uncover the DNA of that brand. And not only do people think they know what the brand is, but they think they know what marketing is, and marketing is the engine that drives brand. And so there's an educational component here, and there's an unfolding of the value. And so it's an educational process with the stakeholders, as well as a discovery process around the brand, because in my experience, there's the question that has to be answered first and foremost is, by the deans, by the faculty chairs, by the vice presidents, by the board, what's in it for me? Is this going to make my school raise more money? Is this going to get me, the dean, positioned with the media to be a spokesperson on issues that I care about? Is this going to drive enrollment and bring to bring greater numbers of the right kind of students to our door? And so it has to be not, we're doing this because it's good for you, which is like cough medicine, that doesn't do the job. It's more, here's what the value is for you and the interests that you have in the job that you're trying to do. And I think that means really listening across the institution and engaging in conversations and being able to then prove that this has real tangible value for the people who will be most affected by this. And you can't really go out with a brand to your alumni and to your students and to your constituents until you really have the internal support and buy-in that's going to make that happen successfully.
Yeah, and to your point, in the work we've done together, we've sort of evolved a concentric circle model of discovery, which is another way of looking at sort of your notion of egalitarian conversations, where we sort of start with the people closest to the vision, which could be, chair of the board, president of the institution, and then work our way out to staff, alumni, donors and students to assemble, and I think you use this word as well, an authentic picture of the school. I mean, nothing works if it's layered on. So what we're doing by dealing with this concentric model is sort of learning and testing along the way, and then ultimately documenting with the goal of being able to sort of write up findings that then make what could otherwise be a very subjective process somewhat more objective, because there's data. Data is always good.
Yeah, and just to your point for 1 minute, that
Sure.
that part of this discovery process is not only discovering what the values are and all the positive things that accrue from this particular institution's education, but it's also what I think that you and your team do so successfully, which is to really take a hard look at what are the perceptions that are not working in favor of this institution. Because particularly for colleges and universities that are new to the branding process or who have an outdated brand, there are the perceptions of this college that are out in the marketplace that, as you often say, have to be managed away, because you really can't look at how a brand is going to be positioned unless you've taken a hard look at some of the ideas that people have simply sort of made up along the way. And that's something that I think is a difficult sell at the beginning for senior leaders, because they think, well, if we just wish it away, it'll go away. But there's actually an active process that has to go into the architecture and the silos of messaging that you do that recognizes these and also recognizes you're never going to get rid of them. But if the strong elements of your architecture and the messages can carry the day, that these are going to eventually kind of fade off and become less important than they are when we first start this process.
Yeah, and you bring up, an exercise that we've done together that, people listening in on this could also do, which is really dig into what the brand attributes, pardon the
Right.
jargon, but those qualities that are associated with a, institution of higher learning. And we look at it in sort of three columns. The positive ones that you want to reinforce, people are pretty clear on those. A sort of aspirational middle column, which really drives brand thinking, like, what do you wish you were known for that you credibly could be known for? And maybe you're actually being that, but the word's just not out. And then what you just touched on, what are some leftover things? So, in our work around Sarah Lawrence, there were a lot of people who still thought it was a school just for women. And that hasn't been true for decades. And, lots of schools have that kind of thing. I mean, we're working with another organization at the moment. It started out as a 2-year college for women, and it's, a 4-year, co-ed organization, but everyone doesn't know that. So sure, you have to manage that away. This is, of course, easier in, a smaller college. It gets trickier. And you and I have worked together in this trickier environment when you're dealing with a university that has schools, departments, pods, centers, whatever, with a lot of vested interests. So, how would you help those people who, have to build a brand at the parent institution level, but the parts also have to come forward? And of course, the goal is that the sum be bigger, not smaller than the parts.
Well, it's such a good question. And you and I have worked together recently on a mid-sized university with exactly this problem, which was that the 5 or 6 schools that made up the university, some of them were very well known, but had the perception was, there was a weak perception in the relationship between 2 or 3 of these schools, the School of Engineering and 2 others. They really weren't perceived as being connected to this university. And so the parts in this case had greater resonance, greater recognition than the university itself. So our challenge was, if you think of it as a system of pistons that are all firing, there was no value or very little value that was accruing down to these schools from the parent itself.
Right.
And so our challenge was to imbue the larger institutional brand with enough value that the schools wanted to connect to it, that there was a benefit in connecting to it, so that the pistons began to not only go up, but they also started to come down. And there was an integrated, connected system of brand value that one served the other, and that there was a continual flow of perception of the university as being the sum of its parts rather than being dependent on its parts.
Yeah, and another way we sort of talk about that is the notion of creating virtuous circles. So probably not going to draw this very well backwards, but if you have a pod, a college or whatever within a university that has success, you want that success to accrue to the university so that it's stronger to launch another initiative, and you want to just sort of keep this going. And that's the goal, and people understand that.
And you also, just to that point, when you've got well-known schools within a lesser-known university whole, the challenge of getting buy-in to that institutional brand is particularly acute, because you've had sort of the survival of the fittest of schools that have had to survive on their own without, for instance, the overriding brand recognition of a Yale or a Harvard or a Dartmouth. And they've had to really kind of make it up on their own. So the job becomes particularly important to give them a reason to believe and give them a reason to begin to give some of their value to the larger concern. And that's something that once one recognizes that, and then you can begin to. We were talking the other day, Roger, about how, again, this isn't a one size fits all, that it means going to each dean, each faculty chair, each department head, and really making the case for this shared sense of value and equity. And I think that that's critically important.
Right. So let's focus for a couple of minutes on marketing to prospective undergraduate students. You know, we both agree that a school should be marketing for yield, which is to say those people who are accepted and actually show up, which really translates to marketing to those students who will be a good fit. Because, you know, just getting applications up so that board members can feel good about increased selectivity is not such a smart, you know, strategy. You spend more money getting kids who aren't going to come, and yes, you look more selective, but you don't necessarily end up with the class you want. So if one is going for fit, which is the smart way to go, how can a strong brand help there?
Well, it's a particularly important question right now, as COVID has overturned the whole process of attracting and retaining, not only attracting new students, but retaining existing students when you can't bring them to campus, or we haven't been able to bring them to campus in the same way to see the shiny new cafeteria or the football field. And so I think that there's been a huge learning curve around developing an entire portfolio of ways to have prospective students and donors experience the campus and the college. But to your point, Roger, I've always thought that that brand is about, a successful brand is about giving different constituents, whether they're prospective students or alumni, an opportunity to be associated with something that's bigger than themselves. It isn't just because the football team is great, or because certain people have gotten into the colleges of their choice. It's really about the idea and the philosophy and the values of an institution that align with one's own, and in many cases expand one's own worldview and one's own sense of purpose. And people need to be able to see themselves within this university or college environment, not just as a student, but as an alum 10 years out, or as a donor 15 years out, or as a potential family down the road. And so the value of identification with an institution goes way beyond the first year students arriving on campus. There has to be the long view that this is a lifetime commitment to a series of ideals and an identity that we want to adopt as our own.
So your notion of alignment, I mean, we certainly both believe in that, but you know, when we build these systems, we also try to think of building sort of tilts into that alignment, or thinking about different spokes under an umbrella. You know, communicating with their prospective undergrad and their parents is different than, you know, trying to, you know, connect with a planned giving prospect.
Right.
So, you know, we all need to try to make sure that brands have the flexibility, verbally and visually, to engage, you know, different constituencies where they are. And we do this on the verbal side by constructing, as you know, messaging frameworks. You know, yes, everybody wants an elevator spiel, but you also need constituent specific messages that sit under that spiel and, you know, are more tailored. And on the visual side, by thinking of visual systems, not, you know, mobile oil era, you know, hard and fast rules, because you, again, you know, the communication to a planned giving prospect is could be different than a 17-year-old. And, you know, and even within visual expression, you know, we've learned, and, you know, many of you sort of tuning in here probably already, you know this, that especially for younger people, visual expression is messaging. You know, how your print and digital materials look, or how your website moves, you know, can either be an invitation to dig deeper or a barrier, you know, text to one side. And we certainly built these systems together. But, you know, we're helping to build systems, and many institutions have in-house talent that needs to be included in the process and certainly in the implementation of a brand. So what are some tips, as someone who has run communication departments, to get in-house groups, up to speed and engaged creatively and over any resistance that might initially be there?
Yes, and again, this goes back to part of our earlier discussion of this isn't a matter of just saying, here, do it. There has to be a buy-in across the institution. And one of the ways, these days, whether it's fundraising and development, or whether it's enrollment, or whether it's student services, there are communication pods within each of those departments who are responsible for executing the materials and the ideas and the policies that come out of each one of these areas of a university. And so one size never fits all. And we know that from experience, that the way you tilt, you were just talking about this concept of tilt, Roger, which is that the brand identity, the brand concept has to be malleable. It has to be tiltable to the needs of particularly fundraising and enrollment. So while there are consistencies, while there are certain, structural elements that remain the same, the way you can use those elements is customizable to an extent. It's a fine line because you don't want people, changing the size of the logo to fit the electronic newsletter. But on the other hand, my experience with internal communications departments is that people want to be able to, people don't want to have to make it up as they go along. They want to be able to have a menu of choices, to be able to say, here are 4 ways of incorporating this logo in your annual fund appeal. Or here's the paragraph that's the boilerplate that incorporates all of the key messages that we want people to understand. And that if they're given this portfolio, this toolkit of brand elements that they feel empowered then to carry the brand forward, because at the end of the day, they're on the front lines. They're the ones that we rely on to implement this overall strategy.
Yeah, and we also follow that up with documentation and training.
Right.
They need to feel, comfortable and fluent, and that they can be creative within a system. I mean, that's
right.
certainly the goal, because you can't do this sort of thing in the corner office. You need to engage as many people as possible into making brands effective.
Yeah, and it also comes down,
okay.
just to let me add
Sure.
this, it also comes down, it isn't simply the view book that we're talking about or the case statement. We're also talking down on the micro level of, designing an email signature that carries the water of this brand, so that the brand is consistent, both large and small, throughout all of the communications efforts that a university makes. And that doesn't happen overnight. You give people the toolkit, you give them the documentation, you do the training, but it's also a matter of kind of running alongside a lot of different bicycles to make sure that people are comfortable and confident that the brand represents the work that they do.
Yeah, I mean, people who have worked with us are sort of tired of hearing me say that, brand building is a process, not an event.
Exactly.
I mean, they'd like to be able to flip a switch, but it doesn't quite work that way.
Right, or they'd like us to flip the switch.
Sure. We know you also work with, executives, often women, on their personal brands in higher ed. Can you talk a little bit about what a personal brand is, so it doesn't just sound buzzy, and how to manage it? Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, brand is one of those overused dog-eared words, and it's really lost its meaning. I think it actually has great resonance now with particularly high-achieving executive women across nonprofits and across business and across women-owned businesses, that it's the same process that we've just been talking about on an institutional level. It's not about look at me, I'm good, recognize my value, take my CV and figure out that I'm the person that you need. It's really much more about putting yourself forward in the way that you want people to see you. And so it's developing your own brand narrative and your own brand style in much the same way that we do for big companies. And it's about, throwing the cards up in the air and seeing where they land and coming out with a personal value proposition that says, these are the things that I've done, and this is what they add up to, and this is the way that I can solve or meet the challenges that you are faced with and which you need my help with. And it's again, an organic, very intrinsic or organic process that I think is an unusual approach these days, because it's just, as I love to say to people, it's not enough to be good. We're all good. The question is how you're going to tell people about that. And at the end of the day, how memorable, resonant, and compelling that brand narrative is. So that's the kind of thing that we work on together.
Right. So you also do a little work, or not a little work, maybe a lot of work, in crisis communications in academia. And our take has always been that if your brand meaning isn't out there and strong, to give context to some really unfortunate incident, then that really unfortunate incident becomes the story. If there's brand context, then it can be better, for lack of a better word, contained, or in any case, managed. So how does having a strong brand, in your view, help in these potentially crisis situations?
Well, yeah, nowhere has that been more evident and more apparent than during the last 18 months as this apocalypse has hit higher ed. It's one of the 3 hardest hit sectors during the pandemic. It is still in the process of recovery. And there's really never been a crisis of this proportion for any of us, but in higher ed, it's been particularly acute. I think that that those with a brand in place have been able to weather the storm in different ways than those who have been sort of floundering around their brand. I like to say that a strong brand is your best friend during a crisis. Without it, you're really out in the cold, and you're susceptible to, not to carry this analogy too far, but to all of the winds that are buffeting the institution. If people perceive the institution through its brand as being strong and confident, then they will cut you slack in a way that has been important to many colleges that I've worked with in the last 18 months, when from one week to another, particularly during the height of this in 2020, no one knew what was going on. It was changing week to week. Were they going to open in the fall? Were they not going to open in the fall? What does hybrid education mean? The kinds of really fundamental questions that people needed answers to were forcing senior leadership, particularly presidents who were on the front lines with this, to be open, to be engaged, and to listen to their constituents, and be able to respond to that information within the context of the values and the identity of the organization. And I think that it's been a great learning opportunity. And I think that, nobody had a crisis communications plan of this magnitude. Nobody was prepared to do the kinds of things that leadership was called upon in the last 18 months. I do think that good things have come out of it, as they always do out of crises. But I think the first step, and I've seen this happen again and again, is you have to admit that there's a crisis. You have to admit that everything is up in the air, and that you as a president, you as a vice president, are going to see people through the storm. And so it isn't only a matter of relying on the brand of the institution, it's also a matter of the president walking, sleeping, and breathing that brand, so that people don't fall away, so that the confidence isn't lost, and so that once the institution comes out the other side, that it is still intact and with any luck stronger than when it went in. And it doesn't matter if it's COVID or whether it's chicken in the cafeteria. Every crisis is a crisis of proportion. And how an institution does that is really a mark of its institutional character.
And the other thing that's been happening during COVID is, organizations have, to use the word of the last 19 months, pivoted. But
Yes.
some of those pivots have, yielded programs or approaches or changes in models that actually reinforce an organization's brand,
Right.
largely if they've been informed by the brand. Some of
Mhm.
these end up, looking like whatever form of pasta being thrown against the wall, and maybe, tactically useful in the short term, don't actually reinforce the brand. So that's another way of thinking about change.
Yeah,
So,
and I think it just, I just, we say the brand, even in this conversation, every fourth or fifth word. And I think it's up to um, brand marketers and brand thinkers like you and me to, really redefine what that means and to re-imbue it with a kind of value that is not questioned anymore, that is not seen in academic and in some cases nonprofit circles as being suspect and expensive and a nice to have but not a must have. If there's one thing we know in 2021, it's the imperative of brand value. And even though you and I have been doing this for a long time, and there's been change, there's been not enough change. And I'm very much hoping that as we go into this next era, that we'll see a new resurgence of branding and the flag that it waves for institutions.
yeah, and that brings us right back to sort of the top of this chat where, I tried to talk about brand as meaning and values and
Right,
what people, connect with and resonate, and not, not your mark or some tagline. And that's why during this period, it's had an outsized say in decision making, because that's how the organization is perceived. Well, we're at the end of our chat, and I certainly want to thank you for, participating, and thank all of you on the other side of the screen for spending some time with Lyn and myself. We hope you found our back and forth useful. You can find Lyn at Lyn, that's Lyn, one N, at lynchamberlin.com. Her website is, not surprisingly, lynchamberlin.com. And I'm at Roger at sametz.com. That's Sametz, but you probably knew that already, and at sametz.com. So we will continue to have these chats, and with people who have been important in our practice and in our engagements with clients. And we hope to see you at the next one. So thanks again, everyone.